in the radiant heart of London's social season, where chandeliers glittered like captured stars and gossip was more valuable than gold, Lady Evelyn Gracewood arrived at her very first grand ball. The daughter of a modest baronet from the countryside, she carried herself with quiet grace, elegant yet understated. Her gown was pale ivory muslin trimmed with lace her mother had sewn by hand. No diamonds sparkled at her throat, no feathers adorned her hair. To the glittering elite of Mayfair she appeared out of place. Too simple, too serene, too real in a room full of painted smiles. But there was something in her calm presence, something unpretending and pure, that drew subtle admiration from those who could still recognize sincerity amid opulence. The orchestra played a waltz, and laughter echoed through the gilded hall of the Ravenshire estate, the grandest ballroom in London. At the centre of it all stood Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravenshire, a man whose every gesture seemed to command attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in black velvet, he was the very embodiment of nobility and arrogance. His reputation preceded him, intelligent, calculating, and merciless in his judgments of others. To be noticed by him was either a blessing or a curse. As Evelyn entered, several heads turned, some curious, some mocking. She smiled politely, unaware that fate had drawn the Duke's piercing grey eyes toward her. He observed her from across the room, his expression a mixture of intrigue and disdain. To him, simplicity was indistinguishable from mediocrity. "Who invited the governess?" he murmured, under his breath to Lord Sinclair, his friend, who chuckled behind his wine-glass. Evelyn, unaware of the remark, moved gracefully toward the refreshments table, her every movement unhurried and poised. But cruel tongues in London were never slow to act. Within moments, whispers spread like wildfire. "That must be the Gracewood girl. No jewels, no fortune. Imagine the audacity to appear so plain." Their laughter rippled softly, poisonous and sharp. Then came the moment that would mark her night, and her resolve. The Duchess Dowager of Ravenshire, the Duke's elderly aunt and hostess of the evening, approached Evelyn with warmth. "My dear, you remind me of myself when I first came to London. There's a calmness in you that this city sorely lacks." Her kind tone caught the Duke's attention, and he strode toward them, his every step measured. "Ah, aunt," he said smoothly, his voice carrying that effortless authority only a duke could wield. "And who is this paragon of simplicity?" Evelyn curtsied politely. "Lady Evelyn Gracewood, your grace." "Ah, Gracewood," he mused. "Yes, I recall your family. Country stock. Loyal, if somewhat unpolished." His gaze swept over her gown, the modest fabric, the simple hairstyle. And then he smiled, the kind of smile that cuts deeper than scorn. "Tell me, Lady Evelyn, did you lose your jewels on the way here, or do you prefer to let your humility sparkle in their place?" Laughter erupted around them. Evelyn felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to lower her eyes. "I find, your grace," she replied softly, her voice steady, "that humility endures longer than diamonds." The laughter faltered. A few nearby guests exchanged glances. Even the Duke's smirk wavered for a heartbeat. But pride was his armor. He gave a polite bow, masking his momentary surprise. "Touché," he murmured, and turned away with a dismissive wave, yet something in her eyes, calm, intelligent, unbroken, unsettled him. As the night went on, Evelyn stood apart, uninvited to dance, yet her composure never cracked. She watched as the Duke danced with glittering heiresses, their silks flashing like jewels beneath the chandeliers. Each spin, each bow, seemed choreographed for display, beautiful, but empty. When the final waltz ended and the guests began to disperse, Evelyn stepped onto the balcony, breathing in the cool night air. The stars stretched endless above her, quiet, indifferent, eternal. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could still hear laughter and music. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Let them laugh," she whispered to herself. "Tonight they see simplicity. One day they will see strength." And somewhere deep inside the grand house, the Duke of Ravenshire poured himself another glass of brandy, trying and failing to forget the soft defiance in her voice. The following weeks unfurled like a slow waltz, graceful on the surface, but filled with invisible steps of tension beneath. London's social season glittered on, each evening a pageant of vanity, where fortunes were displayed through diamonds and smiles polished by ambition. Yet amid the shimmering world of nobles and gossiping debutantes, Lady Evelyn Gracewood remained a quiet enigma. She neither chased attention nor sought approval. While others fluttered like jeweled birds desperate for admiration, she stood still, calm, observant, and utterly self-possessed. Her humility, once mocked, began to whisper its own kind of power. The servants adored her, she thanked them by name. Musicians admired her ear for melody, often finding her alone near the pianoforte after midnight, softly playing tunes that reminded her of home. The Duchess Dowager herself began inviting Evelyn for tea, fascinated by her gentle wit and depth of thought. "There is a steadiness in you, my dear," the old woman remarked one afternoon. "In a city where everyone performs, you simply are." But one man refused to admit that truth: the Duke of Ravenshire. Adrian Blackwell had spent his life judging others from a pedestal built of perfection. Every suit, every word, every gesture, all measured, controlled, faultless. To him, vulnerability was weakness, simplicity was mediocrity. Yet somehow the memory of that countryside girl with the unyielding eyes had lingered like the faint scent of lavender after rain. He told himself he didn't care. And yet, at every gathering, he found his gaze betraying him. At Lady Pembroke's garden luncheon, he noticed Evelyn kneeling in the grass to comfort a child who had tripped, the hem of her gown stained, her hands gentle. At a poetry reading, while others feigned intellect, she listened with quiet sincerity, her eyes reflecting genuine feeling instead of practiced performance. There was a grace about her that had nothing to do with fashion, something disarming, something human. Still, pride dies hard. The Duke masked his curiosity beneath his usual sardonic humor. When she entered a room, he would offer a cutting remark to his companions. "There's Our Lady of Modesty again. One might think she's here to teach charity, not attend a ball." The laughter of others hid the confusion beneath his smirk. For each jest he made at her expense, an unfamiliar sting followed. Guilt, or perhaps admiration he dared not name. Evelyn, for her part, had grown immune to ridicule. Each insult was a test she passed with grace. Her eyes no longer flickered with hurt, but with understanding, a quiet pity for a man too proud to see truth. And slowly the tide of opinion began to turn. Gentlemen who had once laughed now sought her conversation. Ladies whispered envy at her natural poise. What jewels could outshine a woman who shone from within? One evening, at a charity soirée, Evelyn found herself cornered by the Duke once more. The music was soft, the candlelight gilded the air with warmth. "Lady Evelyn," he said smoothly, offering her a glass of champagne. "You seem to have survived London without diamonds after all. Quite the accomplishment." She smiled faintly, taking the glass, but not his bait. "One learns to survive anything, Your Grace, even ridicule." For the first time, his composure faltered. Her tone was not sharp, merely honest, and it unsettled him. "You think me cruel," he said, half in jest, half in truth. "I think you lonely," she replied softly. "And loneliness makes people cruel." Her words struck like a bell, deep and clear. He laughed it off, of course, an elegant, practiced sound, but it echoed in his chest long after she turned away. That night, as he stood by his study window staring at the mist rolling over the Thames, he realized something dangerous was happening. He was beginning to admire the very woman he had scorned. Yet admiration in a man like Adrian Blackwell felt perilously close to weakness, and so he doubled down on his facade, determined to keep her at a distance. But destiny, like music, has its own rhythm, one that no pride can silence forever. Autumn came quietly to London, draping the city in amber light and soft chill, as if nature itself were preparing for revelation. The social season neared its end, but one grand event remained. The Duchess Dowager's Masquerade Ball, a night when titles and reputations were hidden behind masks, and truth was allowed to dance freely beneath candlelight. Invitations were coveted like royal decrees, and whispers said it would be the most dazzling affair of the year. Evelyn received her invitation not from society, but from the Duchess herself. "My dear," the elderly lady had said, pressing the parchment into her hand, "London has looked at you long enough. It's time you let them see you." Her words were cryptic, but filled with warmth. That evening, when Evelyn returned to her modest guest chamber, she found a dress box waiting for her, an heirloom from the Duchess's youth, wrapped in pale silk. Inside lay a gown unlike anything she had ever seen. The fabric shimmered like moonlight, layers of rose-gold satin and soft tulle, embroidered with golden vines that seemed to breathe under the lamplight. Alongside it lay a delicate Venetian mask, carved with filigree so fine it seemed spun from whispers. Evelyn stared at it in awe and disbelief. She had no jewels, no finery, but in that gown she would not need them. It wasn't opulence that defined it, it was artistry, grace, and the power of transformation. On the night of the ball, the city gleamed, carriages clattered through gaslit streets, and the grand entrance of Ravenshaw Hall was awash with laughter, velvet, and champagne. The Duke himself stood at the top of the staircase, a figure of sculpted control, his mask black and severe, like his reputation. He was surrounded by the usual courtiers, women draped in gems, men cloaked in self-importance, but none could hold his wandering attention. He was restless, though he did not know why. Then she entered. The murmurs began like the faint rustle of silk, then grew into stunned silence. The woman who stepped into the ballroom was no longer the plain Lady Evelyn Gracewood that London dismissed. Her presence was radiant, her confidence effortless. The rose-gold gown caught the light like dawn breaking through mist, and the mask lent her an air of mystery that made every eye follow her. Even her walk had changed, not in arrogance, but in serenity, like a woman who had found her own worth and no longer sought it from others. The Duke's gaze found her across the crowd, and something inside him stilled. He did not recognize her, not yet, but the pull was immediate and undeniable. As she passed, her perfume, soft as jasmine, lingered in the air, unsettling his perfectly constructed calm. "Who is she?" he murmured to Lord Sinclair, who shrugged. "A newcomer, perhaps from the continent," the friend guessed. "Whoever she is, Ravenshaw, she's outshining your entire ballroom." Before he knew it, he had crossed the floor. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his heart beat with strange urgency. Evelyn, turned to him slowly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "If your Grace insists," she replied, her voice smooth, calm, familiar but veiled. As they began to waltz beneath the chandeliers, something wordless passed between them. Her grace was flawless, her movements light, yet grounded. There was a strength in her that unsettled him, a quiet command that reversed the roles he had always known. For the first time, the Duke of Ravensshire felt seen, and it terrified him. "Your step is perfect," he murmured, trying to place her. "I would have remembered you." "Perhaps," she said softly, "you weren't looking closely enough." The word struck him like a subtle blade. There was something about her tone, sharp yet kind, restrained yet knowing, that drew a frown to his brow. The music swelled, carrying them through the crowd, her rose gown a blur of light against his dark form. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though they existed outside time. Two souls suspended between pride and revelation. When the final note faded, the Duke found himself reluctant to release her hand. "Tell me your name," he demanded quietly. Evelyn tilted her head, the candlelight catching in her eyes behind the mask. "Names," she said, "can be misleading. Sometimes it's better to learn the soul before the title." And before he could reply, she curtsied gracefully and vanished into the crowd, leaving him standing alone, his certainty unraveling like silk. He searched for her the rest of the night, but she was gone. Only her memory remained, and the haunting realization that for the first time in his life he had been the one left in awe. The next morning dawned grey and silent over London, as if the heavens themselves were exhausted from the night's glitter. Yet within the grand halls of Ravensshire House, whispers burned brighter than candle flames. Who was the masked lady? Where did she come from? Even the Duke seemed bewitched. The gossip was merciless, but beneath its frenzy lay admiration. For once, beauty had triumphed without wealth's permission. Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravensshire, sat alone in his study, staring at the cold embers in the fireplace. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a haunting melody. Her voice, her grace, the way she'd looked at him, unafraid, unpretending, it had disarmed him in ways no woman ever had. For years he'd been the one to judge, to command, to define worth in others. But last night he had been the one measured, found wanting. He spent the day in restless distraction, torn between obsession and disbelief. Who was she? Why did her words echo with familiarity, like something he'd once heard but never understood? That evening he attended the Duchess Dowager's dinner, hoping for clues, and there, amid the candlelight and soft chatter, sat Lady Evelyn Gracewood. No jewels, no mask, just her usual simplicity. And in that moment, everything fell into place. The poised stranger who had captured him, the woman who'd made him feel for the first time, was the same lady he had once mocked for her lack of diamonds. A thunderclap of realization struck him. He had humiliated her publicly, and yet she had shone with grace rather than spite. The air seemed to thin around him. For a moment he could neither breathe nor speak. When their eyes met across the table, Evelyn inclined her head politely, as though nothing extraordinary had passed between them. But her calm expression was a mirror, and in it the Duke saw his own arrogance reflected back with painful clarity. Every jest, every cruel smirk, every shallow measure of worth now returned to him tenfold. After dinner, as guests drifted toward the parlour for music, Adrian intercepted her in the corridor. "Lady Evelyn," he began, his voice low, uncertain for perhaps the first time in his life. "May I have a word?" She paused, her hand resting on the polished banister. "Of course, Your Grace." He studied her face. The same quiet strength, the same gentleness that had unsettled him from the beginning. "It was you," he said softly. "At the masquerade." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You seem surprised." "I am. Ashamed," he confessed, the words heavy. "I mocked what I did not understand. And you taught me the meaning of elegance without uttering a word." She regarded him calmly, her eyes neither cold nor forgiving, merely honest. "You judged me, Your Grace, because I did not wear the trappings of wealth. But tell me, would you have danced with me last night, had you known who I was?" He faltered. The truth cut deeper than any accusation. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice breaking with sincerity. "But I would have regretted it all my life." For a moment, neither spoke. The candlelight flickered between them, painting her face in soft gold. "Society taught me that worth lies in titles," she said quietly. "You taught me that cruelty hides behind charm. Perhaps we were both deceived, Your Grace. But by different masks." Her words pierced him. The Duke, the man who had never been humbled, now found himself utterly disarmed. "Lady Evelyn," he said, taking a breath, "you have every reason to despise me, but if there is even the smallest space in your heart for forgiveness, I would ask to earn it." She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Forgiveness, Your Grace, is freely given. Respect, however, must be earned." And with that, she curtsied gracefully and walked away, leaving him standing in the corridor, surrounded by the ghosts of his own pride. That night, for the first time in years, the Duke of Ravenshire did not attend a ball or dinner. He stood alone by his window, watching the fog roll through the London streets, wondering how a woman he had once dismissed could so effortlessly unravel the armor he had spent a lifetime building. Somewhere in the quiet of that night, pride gave way to something purer, remorse. And in its wake, the first fragile spark of love began to grow. Days turned into weeks, and though London's season glittered on, the Duke of Ravenshire was nowhere to be seen. His absence stirred curiosity and rumour. Some said he had taken ill, others whispered that he was travelling abroad. Yet those who truly knew him suspected the truth. The proud Duke was facing a reckoning not of body, but of spirit. For the first time, Adrian Blackwell found no pleasure in grandeur, no solace in power. The laughter of London had grown hollow. Every crystal goblet, every portrait-lined hall reminded him of the woman whose grace had laid bare the emptiness of his world. He began to change, quietly and without fanfare. The servants noticed it first, the absence of barked orders, the newfound courtesy in his tone. He began visiting the tenements under his care, ensuring food and coal reached the poor families before winter's chill set in. The Duchess Dowager watched this transformation with knowing eyes. "So," she mused one evening, "the lion has learned to bow." When she sent out invitations for her final ball of the season, a charity gala for the city's orphanage, Evelyn hesitated to attend. Though her heart was steady, she had no wish to reopen old wounds. Yet something within her, a whisper of unfinished fate, urged her to go. "It's time," the Duchess had told her with a smile. "Not for him, for yourself." The night of the gala arrived, and London gathered once more beneath Ravenshire's grand chandeliers. The ballroom shimmered with elegance, but there was a softness in the air, a humbler beauty that came not from diamonds, but from purpose. Evelyn wore no mask this time, no borrowed finery. Her gown was pale blue silk, simple yet luminous, her only adornment a single pearl pendant resting above her heart. The Duke entered late, his presence commanding yet changed. Gone was the mocking arrogance. In its place stood a man stripped of vanity, his expression sincere, his eyes shadowed by humility. Conversations fell silent as he crossed the room, but he heard none of them. His focus was on one figure, the woman standing alone near the edge of the dance floor, serene as moonlight. He approached, every step deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of his pride being set down. "Lady Evelyn," he said softly, bowing his head, "may I have the honor?" She regarded him in silence for a long moment. The music swelled, a slow, haunting waltz. "Why now, Your Grace?" she asked at last. "Because tonight," he replied, "I wish to dance not as a duke, but as a man seeking forgiveness." Something in his tone, stripped of all pretense, touched her heart. She nodded once and placed her gloved hand in his. The orchestra's melody filled the air, and together they began to move, not with the practiced perfection of courtly dancers, but with something far rarer: truth. Around them, the glittering crowd seemed to fade. It was as though the entire room bowed to the quiet magic of two souls finally meeting without masks. He held her with reverence, not possession. She moved with trust, not submission. For a moment, there was no duke, no baronet's daughter, only two hearts learning to beat in harmony. As the final note lingered and fell away, he drew a steady breath. "Evelyn," he said quietly, breaking the formality at last. "You once told me humility endures longer than diamonds. I see now, it also shines brighter. I was blind and cruel and undeserving. Yet if time or grace allows it, I would spend what remains of my life trying to be the man you believed I could be." Her gaze softened. "The man I believed you could be, Your Grace, is already standing before me," she replied gently. A smile, small, uncertain, utterly human, touched his lips. He took her hand and in front of the entire ballroom bent low and kissed it. The gesture was not of pride, but of devotion. A collective hush fell. The mighty Duke of Ravenshire, humbling himself before the woman he once mocked. When he looked up, Evelyn's eyes shone with quiet warmth. "Then let us dance again," she whispered, not as penance, but as beginning. And so they did. As the orchestra swelled and chandeliers gleamed like captured stars, the ballroom witnessed a rare kind of miracle, not the triumph of wealth, nor the spectacle of fashion, but the redemption of a heart through love. And somewhere, in the laughter and applause that followed, Lady Evelyn Gracewood smiled to herself, for she had not merely stunned a ballroom, she had changed a man.